welcome back in. Thank you everyone for joining us here on A Deadman's Books. We have another great author interview today. We got to sit down with a great William Walker. He wrote the book The Last Lap. It's the tragic telling of Pete Kreis. He's a Knoxville native. He tried to enter into the Indy racing world in the 1920s and early 1930s, and it's about his mysterious death. He died on a practice lap for qualifying for the Indianapolis 500. There's speculation, was it suicide, was it an accident? Bill's going to talk about that with us in this podcast, but what a cool guy. He's done a lot of things. He tells some great stories. He's done a ton of research for other books that he's written, and he just had a lot of really cool stories to tell us. He was, like I said, a really great person to talk to. We've shared emails back and forth since, and it's been great to get to know him. Like I said earlier on a previous interview with Elizabeth Randall, one thing that I've really enjoyed about these author interviews that we've been so lucky to do is we have met some of the coolest people. I'm thinking about Russ Witcher and Troy Smith and Elizabeth Randall and William Walker. You know, it's been really fun. It's just been really cool to get to know these people and to interact with them. And they've been, like I said, really generous, and we're thankful for that. I love Grand Prix racing. I love Formula One. I love IndyCar racing, sport car racing, Le Mans, all that world entails. I have a sneaky stack of racing and motorsport books on my bookshelf. And when I came across The Last Lap and saw that Pete Kreis was a Knoxville native and the entire story that surrounded him, he goes from Knoxville, he enters into the Indy racing scene, he races at Indianapolis, and then for me what was really cool is he raced a couple of Grand Prix at Monza, and this is during what's, I think, becoming slowly the golden age of motorsport. You're talking about the 40s, 50s, 60s, sometime around there. When I saw that there was a story about a Tennessean, that really grabbed my attention. I bought the book, I read it, and it was worth it. It was such a good book, and the storytelling to it is really great. The research behind it is great. Bill's going to talk about his research process in that, the interviews that he had with his family. But I do want to say, if you like motorsport, if you don't like motorsport, and you are interested again in a really good story, this is a book that's worth reading. It's a nonfiction book. It's a nonfiction narrative, and Bill's going to talk about that also. It's just really worth a buy. I'm going to have a link in our show notes so that you can go and visit and buy that. Bill has also written another book, and he has another one that is about to come out and be published, and he's going to talk about that as well. So, without keeping you waiting, here is Jason Crockett, myself. We're sitting down with the great Bill Walker via Zoom, and we're going to talk about his book, The Last Lap.
If you don't know about me, let me just go through it briefly and tell you. I grew up in Knoxville, and when I was about entering high school, my dad was transferred by Alcoa. He worked for the aluminum company to Western North Carolina. And I moved into a place that I'm trying to think of a place you guys would know that's as remote as this. But I moved into a place called Franklin, North Carolina. And at that point, we could get one television station, and that was from Atlanta, and there were no 4-lane roads coming in, and it was in the boondocks. And I mean, you're talking about, Jamestown, where the great World War I hero lived. That's how far back this was. And so I went to a rural county high school, just like where you all are. My graduating class was under 100 people. And I was lucky enough to get into the University of Virginia, and it changed my life. And things took off from there, you know the rest. But I wanted to assure you that I know what you do, I respect what you do, and it's a delight to talk to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I love that you mentioned Jamestown, because Jason is from Jamestown, and it comes up on our podcast all the time.
Well, Jason, that's great. My adopted field is World War I history, and my first book, which was really more of a scholarly book, was about the big battle that he fought in, and I grew up on a street in Knoxville, who also had a Medal of Honor winner. And I often saw him. My mother wouldn't let me talk to him because he was alcoholic, as many of these kids, many of the veterans were, and who had gotten gassed. I've always wanted to go to Jamestown.
What would you say is your favorite book that you've read or that you know about?
You know, I'd say there are two lines there, Jason. I bailed out of my PhD program at Tulane. I ran out of money. It was very expensive, and I ran out of money. And my wife had a baby, which was her fault, of course. And I say a lot of things with tongue in cheek. Please excuse that. But I am a great fan of poetry. I wanted to teach 19th century British poetry. That was my love. And my favorite personal book is the poetry of a poet that you may have never even heard of. And it's his name is Gerard Manley Hopkins. He was a Jesuit priest, and he wrote some of the most incredible poetry that I know. Now, that's a personal side. And as I have gotten older, I've got more interest in what might happen to me after death. And I like poetry that approaches that. So I'm heavily into W.B. Yeats, Wallace Stevens, and people like Hopkins. But let's talk in a more professional way. I've tried to do some intellectual archaeological stuff. And I write in what's called, it's a recent kind of discipline, but it's called narrative nonfiction. It's nonfiction entirely based on fact. You do not make up quotes. There's nothing, the only thing you do that's novelistic is to set settings. So, for instance, I've been to Indianapolis. I've been to where Pete has been. My World War I book, I spent many days on the battlefield, where the major battle of Americans took place. And I will use that background to set the stage. But I do not make up any quotes, anything in quotation marks or all that way. Now, I began several years ago to think, when did I first get into that? And I'm going to tell you how it happened. There were at least two books that got me into this. One was A Night to Remember by Walter Lord. You may remember that, about Titanic. The other one is a more obscure book about World War II, and I'm heavily into modern European history. But it's called The One Who Got Away, and it's a book about the escape of a pilot, a German pilot in World War II. And I can't even remember, I've got the book behind me or someplace, but I cannot even remember the author's name. But it told about this guy's escape. He was a Nazi pilot, a German pilot, was shot down over Britain, captured, and and then was shipped. He tried to escape a couple of times while he was in Britain. Didn't make it. They shipped him because he was so difficult to deal with to the U.S., or excuse me, to Canada. And he escaped across the border into what was then the neutral U.S. So his story, and it's a great one. It's just a great one. But it tells both A Night to Remember and then The One That Got Away, tell about these things, not in first person, they're third person, but in a novelistic approach. And so that's what I began to experiment with. I had a tough job for 35 years after I thought I had a tough job teaching freshman English. But I went into administration and became the chief spokesperson, vice president for public affairs at Virginia Tech, great school, by the way, Gettysburg College, and then the last place was William and Mary. And to get up in front of the press and to explain why a bunch of freshmen got drunk and did what they did was one of the worst jobs I believe I've ever had. So, and there were more serious things too. I mean, we got into legislative scrapes. My president was at William and Mary in particular was a pugnacious kind of guy, and he loved to take on the governor, believe it or not. If you can imagine what that would be like. So I was out front, and he was right beside me, but we would take on the governor. And the upshot of that is I had absolutely no energy left at the end of the day, so I couldn't write a lick. Mm-hmm. At any rate, I saved up 3 stories that I wanted to write that I had found over the years. One was the World War I story. The second was the story from my youth about Pete Kreis. And the third one I have just finished the text of. It's about a friend of mine who was a member of the underground Jewish movement in Budapest, Hungary in World War II, and he fought the Nazis. And so I have finished my path. And by the way, just say these things as they come across. My grandmother was born in what is now the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. If you know that park, you probably know Cades Cove, a wonderful mountain cove in the quieter part of the park. Ah, you're kidding!
I just finished this book.
My grandmother herded cattle in Cades Cove, and she was the sister of the first doctor in Cades Cove.
Okay.
He would probably be mentioned.
He was.
His name was McGill, mm-hmm. And Tom McGill. At any rate, my grandmother was, I think, having studied Old English literature, and by the way, I took 2 courses in Beowulf and Old English literature and loved it. But that's oral tradition. And my grandmother would tell me these stories about being chased up a tree by a bear, or, whatever it might be, or my relative who was in the Union Cavalry in the Civil War. And I learned this oral tradition. And I had a great impetus to really tell these stories. So when I retired, and I retired early at 63, I began to write the first one. And luckily, I lived long enough to finish them up. Well, that's a long answer to your question. But the favorite books, poetry, 19th century British poetry. And I mean, I teach for a non-credit portion of the University of Virginia, and I'm preparing a course right now about 19th century British poetry. And so it has been a guiding star of my life since I went to college. And then this narrative nonfiction that I'm really fascinated in. I mean, you have to set certain limits for yourself. You're not going to lie. You're not going to make up stuff, but you're going to try to make it as visually interesting and as psychologically interesting as you can.
I do have a couple questions from that. The first one I didn't put on the list, but I was wondering, Hazel, Chris, Oliver, you were talking about Cades Cove. I didn't know if the Oliver was the Olivers that came out of Cades Cove, because I know that they had kind of spread out in the Maryville area. I didn't know if you knew that or not.
My sense of it is Drew, that they weren't from there. Let me tell you where they're from. They were from a lot closer to where you are.
Okay.
They were from the booming metropolis of Wartburg.
Okay.
If you can believe that.
Yeah.
You know where Wartburg is?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I lived in Kingston, Tennessee for a couple years, so I was real close to Wartburg for a little while.
Right. Well, that's where they came from, and they had come from Switzerland, and I've seen the advertisements that got them to buy land at Wartburg. And can you imagine trying to farm in Wartburg?
Mm-hmm.
You know, you put a plow into that soil and you break it immediately on all the stones and rocks. So Hazel's, I guess it would be grandfather, was recruited by the Union forces and came to Knoxville and fought, and then was lucky enough to marry a local girl who had one of the most beautiful farms in East Tennessee. Mm-hmm. It really is a remarkably beautiful place.
The other question I was wondering about was, you were talking about writing narrative nonfiction and making sure, that you were objective. And I think the example that we've talked about is a book that we've covered on our podcast is John Barrett's Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. And when I had finished reading Barrett's novel, I had learned that these stories and characters that he had written about, he had actually not been there for that time period. And I told Jason, my bachelor's is in journalism. And so I don't know if it was like the journalist in me, it kind of irked me a little bit that he had listed this as nonfiction. And so that was why I put that question on there, because I had asked my professor at Tech, Russ Witcher, he wrote a book called Going Home to Die No More, which is about a train robbery. And he wrote his from a journalistic aspect. But he was telling me, he felt like that as long as you were preserving the ideas of the character and, like you said, not really speaking for them, then you were kind of maintaining that objectivity. But you were talking about narrative nonfiction, and I'm thinking of, I know I'd emailed you about reading Eric Larson, and I'm thinking of David Grann and a couple others that I've read lately. But I didn't know what your thoughts were about the line that we draw when we are writing narrative nonfiction, because I know that when I read nonfiction, I enjoy the narrative nonfiction a lot more than just and I mean, I'm a journalist, but just the plain journalist retelling of it, so I didn't know what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I'm with you. I came at journalism in a little bit of a skew. When I dropped out of my PhD program, I unfortunately had finished all my coursework, which was, like doing it all for nothing. I took a job writing for a boating magazine on the Mississippi River. And one day I was in the classroom. The next day I was out hopping barges on the Mississippi River. And I mean that literally. I though, when I began to work in communications or public relations, I met so many good journalists. And I mean, I love journalism, that I began to adopt their methods. And, if you're going to be honest, and you better be honest in that kind of work, you have to adhere to certain principles. And frankly, Drew, I was pretty strict with myself about the observance. I will not make up quotes, and I have something to tell you guys, that a story here in a second that I'm still trying in a way to deal with. And it involves the Pete Kreis book. So remind me to go back to that. I don't, somehow I wouldn't feel like it was legit if I made up stuff or even created stuff. So what I will do, let's go back to the World War I book. I have been in the bunkers. I know where my principles stood. And I've tracked them down. I do an immense amount of research, years and years and years, and to the point that in the World War I thing, I bought trench maps that were on eBay, original trench maps, and went to these bunkers and the trenches. And I just don't, now when I'm in the trench, and I'll stand there for a while and I'll say, okay, what ridge could I see out here? What would it be like? If I'm in the bunker, I'm going to take a look around the walls and see what's on the walls, what might have been there. And then I'll feel comfortable that I can write about that and talk about it, and create the, if you will, the atmosphere. But I don't fabricate stuff, nothing. Now, let me tell you, and this is going to take me a few minutes, but let me tell you the latest on the Pete Kreis book. My debate at the end is whether Pete committed suicide, which I opted for, or whether he had one of these maybe epileptic spells or flashbacks that caused him to run off the road. I came down to those two options. And Hazel's story, and by the way, this lady, you guys are from the South, you know what I'm talking about. She was like an aunt to me. I mean, I got to know her over this period of time, and she was so kind and so thoughtful to me that I loved her. And I would never, I believed her implicitly, and I still believe her implicitly. Now, about a year ago, the book had come out, the Pete Kreis book. I got a call one day from the president of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And he said, Mr. Walker, I'm calling you with some information about Pete Kreis that you obviously don't know. And he said, this may upset your interpretation. Do you want to hear it? And I said, absolutely. I said, I set out to find the truth, not to adopt a story that I would tell. So what he told me is when he came into this job, he worked for Roger Penske. I don't know whether you guys know who Roger is, but one of the guys who was leaving said, his name is Doug. He said, Doug, I want to show you something. Here is a walk-in vault in their headquarters. And he said, every secret, you're not going to believe this story, by the way. He said, every secret about the Indianapolis Motor Speedway is in this vault. And he said, you need to read through every file, and there were file cabinets and so forth. So you will know what those secrets are, so you'll know how to handle them if they come up. So Doug had a family gathering for Thanksgiving. They were together 3 or 4 days. And he handed out to all of his family members, he portioned out the files. And he got the file that was about Pete Kreis. Now, and there's more to the story. I'm going to tell you, but do know there's more to it. So, at any rate, he said, I found this little envelope inside. And he said, there were 2 cards inside the envelope. It had Pete Kreis on the outside. And on the first card, it said, I received this ring and watch from Pete Kreis's body after his accident. And it was signed by the medical examiner of Indianapolis. He worked at the major downtown hospital. On the other one, it talked about the riding mechanic. And the riding, it said the same thing I received from the body of McCall, not McCall, forgotten the guy's name, Hahn, the following items. And the medical examiner signed. So he said, if I'm, Doug then went back and he said, that's all that was in this envelope. But he said, you realize that may disprove what your cousin Hazel told you, that Pete had taken off his diamond ring and given it to his pit crewman, his pit crew. And I said, you're right. Let me think about this for a while. And I said, I'll need to do something about this. Well, I've written it up as a 2 or 3 page article. And, everybody in the racing world ran an article about this, about Pete. And I tried to get everybody to print this article for me, and they wouldn't do it. And basically what I said, the finding of these 2 cards doesn't really disprove what Hazel said. It still have been conveyed, the ring could have been conveyed from Pete to his pit crew to the medical examiner, because it doesn't say it that clearly. And I said, but it does raise questions about that interpretation. To me, it was a clear sign that he committed suicide, that he had planned this. So at any rate, I correspond with Doug every Indianapolis 500. He's invited me up, and I just haven't been able to come. But I'm stuck with this. I've mailed this story to everybody. I've had people tell me, yeah, we're going to run it. They don't run it. And I want to get it on the record. And so that should indicate to you the level of commitment that I have to keeping with the facts.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Can I exercise one suggestion here?
For sure.
And I'll tell you what it is. I like the story. I like one of the questions. I was really surprised to learn this is in many ways a Tennessee story. Yeah, it is. What do you think makes this such an iconic Tennessee story? Why do you think it's been left out of so many historical narratives? I wanted to, since both of you are English teachers, I wanted to broaden that a little bit by saying this. I'm not sure it's a Tennessee story. If you're from East Tennessee, and I would say you guys are not, I'd say you're from Middle Tennessee. If you're from East Tennessee, you're a bit at odds with the other parts of the state. And I would say in a more positive way that it's a Southern story. And I was a great reader of William Faulkner. Took a PhD level course on him. And I would say it's Southern rather than Tennessee. And what I would say the reason it's Southern is that it's so deeply ingrained in family and family tradition. And I think one of the great strengths of the South is the Southern ethos that attracted me to the Pete Kreis story. I learned it I learned about Pete in a typical family way. My mother dragged me along to help clean her relatives' graves. And then I began, the tombstone enthralled me so much that I began to ask questions. And it's funny, my mother was a pretty neurotic person and had grown up in real poverty. She was from the poor side of the family. The Kreises were of unbelievable wealth. I mean, can you imagine a father walking into the Duesenberg plant and saying, I want to buy one of your race cars? You know, it's if you know Formula One racing, I mean, it would be the equivalent of buying a McLaren today.
Mm-hmm.
And and he wrote the check. We got this car, and Pete was on the team. Said, well, if you do this, your son's got to be on the team. That was an incredible family story.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a novel that is not a famous one by Faulkner. It's an important novel, and it's called Banners in the Dust. It was one of his early ones, and it was about a young man from Mississippi who had always heard about a tale of the heroism of a Confederate cavalryman who was his uncle. The cavalryman rode with Jeb Stuart. By the way, he's from Stanton. And they were raiding a Union camp one day, and they got in very cleanly and got away and stole a lot of guns and ammunition and other things. And as they were riding away, one of the guys said to the uncle from Mississippi, said, you know, it's too bad we didn't get any of those anchovies that were on the table. And the uncle said, anchovies? Wheeled his horse around and rode back to the Union camp and was killed trying to rescue the anchovies. Now, that's the kind of foolish family story that Pete Kreis represented to me. You know, driving fast, but living a fast life. And I think that's the essence, if you think back to so much Southern literature that you've read. And it, of course, speaks to the power of the past and the power of these stories to enthrall you and in a way capture you. Now, what happened to the guy in Mississippi is that he enlisted in the RAF in World War I and became a pilot like Pete and on the circuit, and after World War I, and killed himself in a stunt. And here he is. He's adding to that family narrative. That's a destructive narrative. Began in the Civil War, or maybe even earlier, and then went through World War I, his stunt flying, his death, early death, and he leaves a son who is clearly going to be hearing those stories and propelling himself into trying to live up to that kind of narrative. So, in summary, I would say it's a Southern story. Does that make sense to you guys?
Jason, that was your question. Do you have anything to follow up with that?
I think my follow-up would be that, Mr. Walker, I could just sit here and listen to you tell stories all day long. Bill, I could listen to you tell stories all day long. I agree with you 100% on the necessity for sticking to facts while also telling the human story. And the three of us are English teachers. We have worked with students who don't always see the importance of, getting the historical truth or the factual relevance out of these stories that we're digging up. And when you were speaking about how your mother had dragged you to go help clean up gravestones, it made me think of my aunt taking me out for decoration. And, we're doing the same thing, learning about family members that you wouldn't otherwise have ever known about. I was going to ask you that with my senior class, our research project is an oral history where I want the students to pick a topic that they think is relevant to them. And it could be family, it could be career, it could be something local. But I want them to do an oral history project where we go through learning about that. So many of our students, A, don't see the immediate relevance, but also B, give up at the first sign of struggle. Well, I can't find an answer. Well, it's not there. What am I supposed to do? So my next question to you was going to be, what would you say to young people about why that kind of research matters? And your own experience, the rewards, the risks of sticking with something that you're researching that's not always so easy to find out about.
First of all, let me congratulate you on getting involved in oral histories. I think is the key decision to getting kids involved with history. And I don't know. And let me say this, by the way, when I was at Gettysburg College, if you can believe, by the way, I don't know whether you know the history of Knox County, but my forebear's house was the second oldest house in the county. It's called Ramsey House, and it's in the eastern part of the county. Do you know it?
I just saw it on the Heartland series.
Yeah. Well, my forebears were the Rams. And the incredible thing I found, I began to read Dr. Ramsey's. I knew he was from Pennsylvania, or the family was. Turns out that they were from the town where we settled when we moved to Gettysburg.
Wow.
And incredibly, my friend owned the house and had done the research that proved it was the Ramsey.
Wow.
So it was a miraculous thing. And it looks just like the house in Knoxville. And frankly, Ramsey was my only Confederate relative. The rest were Union. And I bet you he moved. They came through Virginia down the valley to Knoxville right after Pennsylvania declared slavery illegal. And I think they moved to preserve their slaves. That's a sad thing, but I think that's what happened. And nobody wants to hear that in Knoxville, I can tell you that. But at any rate, at Gettysburg College, that is the doing oral histories. That's the way that they've really gotten kids into history. And of course, most people who come to Gettysburg are interested in the Civil War. So you have that. And I would say what got me involved in the Pete Kreis story was the mystery of the thing. I began to notice that there were a lot of people, when I asked about Pete, who wouldn't tell me, wouldn't answer my questions. And immediately that began to say to this young kid, hey, there's something here I got to look into. And I did not know, Jason, if that would do it, if you could say, hey, let me tell you about a family mystery that's in my family and tell you how I worked through this and what I found out. And then if you could start a class discussion, tell me about your family mysteries. What do you wonder? What do you think about? What did your uncle who came back with one arm from World War II, what happened to him exactly? You want to know that. And then I do not know. I don't know, the kind of, I can't express, it's hard to express to you the kind of chain of evidence that I have found doing research. I have found stuff that seems to me miraculous when I found it. I'll give you an example. I don't know whether you've ever gone, probably haven't, and I have too often, gone to the National Archives in Washington. To get to the papers, you have to go out to Maryland, just across the line. It's not hard to get to the campus, near the campus, the University of Maryland. They have all the papers and the documents. And you go in, and there are people, archivists, who are supposed to help you. And so, when I was doing World War I said, hey, I'm looking at the battle in the Meuse-Argonne campaign, the battle of a hill called Montfaucon. And I told the two leading archivists about this. Now, these guys have written article after article after article about the Meuse-Argonne. They knew what I was doing. So I was probably there and would talk to these two guys, and I could give you the names of them right now. They were senior people. And I'd come back and, oh, you're still looking for Montfaucon, are you? Yeah. So I'd about reached the point that I couldn't go any farther. And I mean, this was after 10 years. I'd go down on my holidays or during the summer. And I walked in one day, and neither of the senior archivists was there. So the guy who was there dealing with World War I, and by the way, I mean, man, it's tough to get through these things. These documents, you're going back to the original stuff, and some of them are falling apart. So I meet this young guy, about Drew's age, let's say, and introduced myself. And I said, I've been working with these two fellows. One of them is named Jockelson, and the other one slips my mind right now. Two senior guys. But I said, I'm still looking for stuff on this Battle of Montfaucon. And we talked for a few minutes, and he said, now, have you seen the big file on Montfaucon? And I said, what file are you talking about? And he said, well, it's a file about the controversy that you're looking at. And I said, no, I have not seen it. I'd love to see it. I said, where is it? Because I've looked everywhere for something like that. He said, it's in Mitch Jopson's office. He keeps it in his office. Now, why did this guy, was assigned by the National Archives? You're grinning, I can see, Jason. You may have run into some. why in the hell did he not give me that? The guy went to the office. Jockelson wasn't there. Went in and got this thing, brought it out, and it's precisely what I needed. Precisely. And then this guy said, I spent 2 days. I just took off from work. So I'm staying here till I get this done. And because, man, there are 40 million folders in this building. If you let it go back in the pile, you may never find it again. At any rate, I got it done. So this guy comes out. I said, man, I can't thank you enough. And I did not squeal on his friends. I knew it would put him in some jeopardy, I thought. At any rate, he said to me, now, do you know that one of the senior generals in this thing was called before a court-martial about this very event? What? He said, no, you'll have to go back to the Library of Congress because that's where that is. If I hadn't met this guy, if I hadn't come in on that day and met this guy who was so forthcoming and helpful, I wouldn't have found the first book. I couldn't have completed that book. And I did not put that in the book because I thought I might be going back to the archives sometime, and I did not want to run into a couple of people who wanted to kill me. But isn't that a fascinating story? What do you make of it?
I think that's fantastic. You talk about serendipity. And if you had not been there at that moment and this day to talk to one person to unlock what you call a chain of evidence is absolutely accurate.
By the way, I really heartily recommend that book to you. It's called Betrayal at Little Gibraltar. And I worked on it 20 years. And what I would do, by the way, when I had the job that was really tough, I'd come home and I'd be nearly dead. And all I could do is watch television, normally the news, so I could be up on what I was going to face the next day. But at any rate, I could sit and use my computer to track down things. And I could find pictures and I could find, letters. And so what I did, and my wife did not appreciate this, I'm a guy who tries to do double duty all the time. And I write in front of the television, watch a movie, and I can do fairly well at that for some reason or another. I always go to a quiet place when I really have to get down to business. But at any rate, I can't tell you how many times just hitting on, entering the word Montfaucon and hitting on that I found these things that, and if you want to read somebody called it, one of the reviewers called it a World War I mystery. And it really is that. So take a look at that one, get that one. And don't buy it from the publisher. There's a great publishing house, Scribner, which Simon & Schuster, but buy it off ABE, American Book Exchange, and you'll get it for a lot less money.
Yep. We are fans of that.
Yeah, I can imagine. And here I am, 81, and I'm thinking, what in the hell am I going to do with all these books? Now, the World War I book worked because I found the letter at Gettysburg College Library. So I have friends there, head of the history department at the library, and he's married to the librarian. So I called them and said, look, I've got this collection of books and papers, battle maps, photographs, and I know you guys are doing oral histories. So I said, I want to give you these so you can put students on them. And there's this connection to Gettysburg College. And so they've taken all those. And I'm a great believer in oral history. I'm really, maybe, I don't know quite how to say this, but what my friend, this is a guy named Mike Berkner, And Mike has had great success in telling his classes. He'll take a class of methods class, and he'll say to these kids, we're going to do some oral history. So this worked 10 years ago. It probably wouldn't work as well now for obvious reasons. But he said, we're going to do an oral history of the people who live around the college and live here in Gettysburg who fought in World War II. So he would have found the names of some of these people from the VFW, and he would assign a kid to go out and talk to one of these people about World War II and do oral history. Then he would teach the methods class based not only on the oral history, but on the internet and other stuff that he had available. So maybe if you guys could pick out, something that would be really something interesting about your local community. I don't know if there was lynching there. I mean, there probably was lynching everywhere. I don't know what would be. I mean, it may be much more current than that. But if you can find something like that and assign the kids to go out and talk to different people, then maybe what one finds will stimulate another. At least that's what Mike Bergner found. So.
I really like that idea.
I will tell you, I don't know, I mean, surely, there was some guy, I'm really a World War II historian. I'm more interested now in World War I. But as I recall, there was some guy from your area, somewhere between you and Hohenwald, who became a high Nazi official, and he was from Middle Tennessee.
Wow.
Have you heard about that?
No, I've not heard of that.
I don't know. Once again, my mind is leaving me, of course, slowly at this point. But I don't know where I found it. I've tried to look him up again, but this guy was a German immigrant who then got into the Bund, the American Bund, and immigrated back to Germany and became a fairly significant German official during World War II. I mean, something like that.
Right.
It's got to be there. It's got to be.
I think even just a spark like that absolutely makes me want to do an oral history about that topic now.
Well, I have looked for it again. See, I find these things that I know that I made a copy of, but I don't know where the copy is.
Sure. Well, whenever you're researching like this, I know I read in the book that you started your conversations with Hazel in, I think, 1978, and the book was published in 2023. And, you were talking about how you worked on your World War I book for over 20 years. How is your method in writing? Do you gather all that research at once and then go, or do you kind of write and research at the same time, or do you kind of outline what's kind of your method as you go about, especially such a long period between when you start and when you finish?
And Drew, the longest one would be the current one, which is about Hungary. And I can tell you when it began. When I was 12 years old, the Hungarian revolt took place. And the Hungarians revolted against the communists, the Russians, essentially. And I guess I was waking up to, at that point, to foreign affairs. I was interested in that. My uncles had been in World War II. At any rate, I became very interested in that revolt. And my parents took Life magazine, and there was a lot of photo coverage of the revolt there. And it was a bloody fight. And there was a picture that I still remember very clearly of a young woman, 15 years old, carrying one of those Russian machine guns, submachine guns with the round drum magazine, who was ready to face off against the Russian troops who were coming back in to take over Budapest. I began to read everything I could, beginning in 1956, on Hungary. And over the years, I just kept reading it. And I didn't write down anything. But over the years, I would read as much as I could about Hungary. I just got very interested in it. When I went to Gettysburg College, our Civil War scholar was a Hungarian. And I began to visit with him. He became a very close friend. When I moved to Williamsburg, my neighbor across the way, a very wealthy man, was a Hungarian doctor. And I began to talk to him. Now, I have a sense he's now deceased, but I have a sense he was on the other side, to be frank with you. And then at the same time, I met a guy who had given a lot of money to the college to found a Center for International Studies, who was who worked in the Jewish underground when he was a boy, 17, 18 years old. Then I began to question. I would say that I began to meet this guy who was the underground worker in maybe 97 or 98. About 2000, I started taking him out to lunch and making notes about what he was saying. And I made the mistake at that point to say, if things work out, maybe I can do a book about you. Well, it was a mistake, because the guy who I love like a father is 99 now and pesters me every day about this book. And I thank God I've gotten it done. I've gotten it done. And it's interesting. I'm trying to get it published now. At any rate, okay, so it goes from there. My wife and I enjoy travel, so we did a lot of traveling in Eastern Europe. Went to most every country from Poland on down through Hungary to Yugoslavia. And when I got to Hungary, I knew places I wanted to go and see that had historical meaning. So when I began to talk to my friend Frank, I said, Frank, I'm going to take 2 weeks, my 2-week vacation, and I'm going to go to Budapest, and I'm going to go to every place you told me about. And my wife and I loaded up, and we found Eichmann's headquarters, which was in an old rundown hotel. It's way out up on a mountain. We found places where the massacres were. And believe me, the people in Hungary don't like to talk about this stuff because they're deeply involved in the killings. And we went everywhere. So my daughter graduates from a place called Guildford College back in about 2000, it'd be about 96, 97. And she's always done a lot of international stuff. So she wanted to be in the Peace Corps. So she applied, and they accepted her right away. She's pretty cool about that. By the way, here's something too. She has a PhD now, but she dropped out of high school.
Wow.
And that was a rather traumatic experience for her parents, as you can imagine. At any rate, so they said, where would you like to go? Would you like to go to Africa? Would you like to go to Asia? And she said, no, I'd like to go to Eastern Europe someplace. Well, when they came to put her on the plane, and they don't tell you too much about where you're going before you go, they sent her to Hungary. And so we did 2 long visits with her in Hungary and got to know the people and love them. The common people are just great people. At any rate, do you see how this thing just built? And I know when I describe what a street looks like in Budapest, I know what it looks like. I know what the opera house is like. I know what the best restaurant in town looks like, where my friend used to have dinner at a table where the 3 tables away were the SS. You know, I know is where he carried a bag of gold coins to Adolf Eichmann up to this hotel. I know what the hotel looks like. So all of these things have worked in a miraculous kind of way to build my interest and to give me that insight that I need. It's a wonderful story. You know, I mean, I'll be honest, I couldn't have had a better life the last 20 years. My life before that, I went through some horrific educational crises, and I was president and an advisor to 2 presidents who lost their jobs, and that was like being on the Titanic when it went down, and it was not fun. But since I retired and began writing, it's just been incredible. By the way, I told you that I'm always, what do they call it? Double tasking, whatever it's called. But I at the computer the other night, I found an article. I read and I have been a reader of Hungarian newspapers forever. I found an article about this young lady who carried the machine gun against the communist or the Russian troops. She was killed 10 minutes after the shot was taken. And found that somebody has tracked her down, and they built a monument to her. And closed that loop. History's incredible stuff. Poetry is too.
I had read that you drove the circuit at Monaco, which immediately got my attention.
Yeah.
And you were talking about these researching and going to these places.
What kind of racing do you like, Jay?
I've been watching Formula One since I was probably about 12. And I like to watch the Le Mans and read about all of that. So that's why I put in the notes the chapter you had written where they went to Monza to take on the Italians and the Europeans, and you had Campari. I've read about Campari in some books that I've been reading, and that was like, I was so excited to read that. And you talk about the Parabolica corner, how dangerous that was. And I know I'd mentioned Wolfgang von Trips, you know, he died on the Parabolica corner. And I was just like, that was my favorite chapter to read about, because it made me excited. I was reading about a Tennessean set the fastest lap at the Grand Prix at Monza, you know, and I thought that was just so cool to read about. But I didn't know if
you ought to do an article on it. Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't. Did you go to Monza or did you just go to Monaco?
No, I've not been to Monza, unfortunately. I've been to southern Italy a good bit, but but I've been. I'll tell you what I do, and you guys might think this is silly, but I have tracked down lots of places this way that have been very important to me. But I go on Google Earth, and you can go right to these places.
Yeah.
And, you know, if the road runs, you can look at the damn building. And now the buildings that I mentioned in Budapest, I have been to. I've been inside them. And but if I can't get to a place, now there are places that Frank didn't mention, that I didn't visit. But, you know, I got a Google Earth, put in a street address in the middle of Budapest, and it takes me right to that street. And I use Street View, and I can see what kind of place it is. I use every device, every program known to man, and that is it. By the way, I'm a great fan of Formula One. I've only been to one race, and that was Canada.
That's awesome, though.
And I think all you need to see is one. I mean, you need to see one live to see what that's all about. And Jan and I, my wife and I, were traveling through France, and we'd gone down to the Med, and I watched the race from a little town, a bar in a little town in France, and then we drove down to Monaco the next day. The barriers were still up.
That's awesome.
They'd reopened the streets, but the barriers were still in place.
Mm-hmm.
So I got on the circuit and drove it 3 or 4 times.
That is
it
awesome.
took me 20 minutes. They do it in what? 3 minutes? And at any rate, and even Jan got into it. It was just so much fun. I would love to go to Monza, and I had a great friend here who was my buddy on Formula One. And we were going to go to Monza, and the poor guy died a couple of years ago. Didn't make it. So I doubt that I will do it. But, the other thing that interested me, as I say, I read widely when I start. I found that there was some guy in Florida, you'll see it in the book, who wrote about the death cult of Italian Formula One racing. Mm. And I found this essay, and then I found that he wrote a book, and I said, look, the book, if you publish through university presses, it's going to be $150. So I didn't want to pay that much. And I said, hey, could you send me that chapter? And the guy did, and he's just a great friend now. And here is this, that with Mussolini, and tying back into my interest in modern European history, taking these daring risks was a key thing. And if you died, well, you became a martyr. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the ethos that Pete, I still believe deep down that he committed suicide. And I think the reason he did, he realized that he had exhausted the possibilities. He wasn't going anywhere. He had gotten a car at the last minute. Mm-hmm. It was nobody else was qualified to drive it, essentially. He saw a terrible wreck on the way to the track that day that had killed a couple of people. And I think he said, hey, it's time to hang this one up. Now, the one thing that gives me pause is that he had a riding mechanic with him. But keep in mind, he went directly into the wall. There were no skid marks, no brake marks. I still think that there was something like this death cult of the Italian racers that somehow got to him.
Well, I know Enzo Ferrari fascinates me because he was so willing to sacrifice his drivers for a victory, and they would die, and he would go to the wives of the drivers and be like, oh, we're never going to race again. But then the next Sunday he would have a new driver out there, ready to go. And so I think that that's one thing that fascinates me about motorsport during this era, is because I don't know, what do you think about that? If it was passion, if it was obsession, they a lot of them knew that I could probably die today, but they still kept pursuing that. And I was wondering too about Pete, because his career started off really, he was finishing top 10s, a couple of podiums. You talked about how he would have podiumed at Monza, I just didn't know if it was like a perfect storm where he had trouble getting a ride, and then the Great Depression happens, and then more responsibility from the family business, and he couldn't, like I said, he couldn't find a reliable car. I didn't know if this was like a perfect storm to where this obsession or this passion had kind of driven him to, I guess, whatever decision he made.
Well, there are two or three things I want to tell you. Number one, when I went to Canada to see the race, a friend of mine had a pit pass, and I got to go to the pits a couple of times, and even at that point they would let you in when it was hot, and you know what I mean. The cars were running, and it's a dangerous spot to be. But I got into a press conference, an impromptu press conference, and stood about 3 feet from Ayrton Senna when he answered questions.
Wow.
And I think Senna fascinates me. And if you read about the accident at Imola, you know, he had seen a friend killed, a day or two before. I think there was something about that man. Verstappen reminds me of him. He was a little cocky, but I did admire him, and the man had something that was beyond the normal human being. I don't know what it was and how it happened, but just from that being there for 15 minutes and seeing him up close and answering questions was incredible. I hate to think that I would go to races to see wrecks. I don't, you know, when I see them, they scare you to death. And yet there is something about the high odds, the high stakes of a Formula One race, when you really understand what it's all about, that just sort of mesmerizes me. And in a lot of ways, Jason, not Jason, but Drew, I'm in some degree ashamed to admit that, because I feel like that there is that. I should tell you guys one more thing that I did not put in the book. I found that the immediate Kreis family, 2 brothers, 3 sisters, that in that group and their children, there were 5 suicides. And I think the family has some sort of gene that allows them to get, I don't know quite what it is, very discouraged, depressed. And there are 5 suicides. One of Pete's, you know, I think Pete's 2 brothers committed suicide. The son, and there was only one son of one of them, this guy wanted to be an opera singer, and he was pretty good at it. So his mother took him to Hollywood. There was somebody, a great singer. And this guy, and I did not put this one in because it was too gruesome. He worked with this teacher to become a better singer. And one day the teacher said, "Hey, I've had enough. Let me tell you, I'm sorry to say this to you, but you're not going to be an opera star." Kid went home, chiseled out a spot in a wood floor in his apartment, one thing, stuck a knife in it with the blade sticking up, jumped on it and killed himself after he heard this bad news about the fact that he wasn't going to be an opera star. That's the kind of people these people are. And it's still going on. Another one, my generation, a very, very wealthy and beautiful woman, had one of those traumatic brain injuries. She fell off a curb and hit her head, and now has lost memory and that sort of stuff. Her son, who runs this posh, you may have never heard of this, but there's a place called Blackberry Farm. It's at Walland, which is right before you get to Cage Cove. It's a place they fixed up and established. The cost per person per night is $1,500. That's, everything included, meals and so forth. Her son, they had a home at Vail. He was skiing, ran into a post, died. There's something about the family, whether it's risk-taking or depression, but it's a sort of doomed family. And I would never write that because I don't subscribe to that kind of thinking. But that's the kind of family it is. It's just, Faulkner could not have written about these people because there's too much trouble, and he would have been making it all up.
Why do you think Pete didn't consider, I guess, a career in Europe earlier? I know he had mentioned it leading up to that last Indy that he was thinking about going to take on the Europeans again, because I was rereading through the book this past weekend and I watched the Grand Prix Sunday at Silverstone, and I don't know if you watched it, but it was just an absolute monsoon, and it stopped raining. It stopped raining, at the end of the race, and George Russell wanted to go on the slicks and he ran off the track immediately. And I thought about that. I thought about the part in the chapter where they went the second time to Italy, and the Americans didn't bring the rain tires. They only had slicks, and Pete was making his way around Monza, in the rain. And I just thought he still was leading, I think, at one point, wasn't he? And I was just thinking, what a driver to be able to do.
Yeah, very late. Yeah,
I just didn't know if you had any insight to why he might have not considered going to Europe earlier than that.
I think it came down to those. By the way, did you know Christian Horner was fired?
I saw that. I was wanting to bring that up to you. I saw that this morning, and that was a shock to me a little bit.
I couldn't believe it.
I know.
I couldn't believe it. At any rate, I think it had to do with something like that. And I don't mean getting fired or the notes that he sent to the women or whatever, but I think it had to do with getting a ride. And he knew that he couldn't make it without getting a ride. And it was just all of that mechanical stuff about getting a ride. So, the mechanics, I don't mean physical, the guys that worked on engines, but I mean, the logistics of getting it all put together just didn't come together for him. And I would imagine, I think he had developed a reputation as a hard luck driver at that.
Mm-hmm.
Whether he calls it or not, we could discuss forever. But I think that reputation actually did him in.
That's something else that fascinates me about that era.
But I think it's fascinating that you've got that. No, you go now.
I was going to say that what fascinates me about this era also, that I don't think people who are just now coming to like Grand Prix racing or Indy racing or even NASCAR, you were talking about him trying to get a ride. I'm thinking about Sterling Moss. I read a biography about Sterling Moss and how, he was with Aston Martin and then he kind of bounced around, and he was lucky to get his ride at Lotus. And it wasn't really Lotus. They were kind of lending them the cars, and I just think I don't think people understand, like with Pete's case, that it wasn't a situation of here's a contract, let's race. They kind of had to bounce around. Even when he left Duesenberg to Miller, that was something that commonly happened. I'm thinking about Phil Hill. Phil Hill raced for Ferrari for a little bit, and he kind of bounced around like that. So I don't know. I just think it's really fascinating, and it's just interesting to see, because you read about Sterling Moss and Phil Hill and others like them, Von Trips. They bounced from Mercedes to Ferrari. Rudy Capicola, I don't know if you've heard of him, but they go from like Mercedes to Ferrari, back to Mercedes or to Lotus. And you read the success that they had, but then you've got a person like Pete who we kind of see the opposite of that, you know. So I think it's just interesting the inner workings of all of that.
I think the other thing is that it was within the reach back in Pete's time. If you were a fairly wealthy person, not a world-class wealthy,
Yeah,
but you could go in, as he did, his father did, and buy him the car. And you know, as you know, there's no way that could happen today unless you were one of the top drivers. If you had, you know, if you'd been Senna or you'd been Hamilton, who's my favorite, you know, you could buy a car, but not many people can do that. I think you're exactly right. And it had to do with luck and timing and who was there at a particular time. You know, there was some suggestion that Horner may have lost his job. I don't know whether you saw this clip. Somebody had asked him, "What are you going to do if you lose Verstappen?" And he laughed and he said, "We're going to go after Piastri." And you know, it was probably a joke, but the person who posted that said, "Oh, this is what cost him his job." I guess that he would be so flippant about it, but I just think that today it's such a, you know, I mean, look at this guy who just graduated from high school and came up through karting. What a, you know, his mother's. Have you studied did you study your books so he could graduate from high school? I think it's such a crapshoot that that it's just almost miraculous luck for these people to get through this stuff. But I hope, you know, I hope, Jason, we're not boring you with all this race stuff. It's
No, not at all.
If you're not into Formula One, you need to stop going to church on Sunday.
It really has been good to hear about all of this. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by it, and part of it is it's the technical stuff, and so I love technology, and that's what it made it possible for me to work on towboats in the Mississippi River. I love to go into engine rooms and see the big diesels, and you know what reverse reduction gears are, and how all that works. I love that. But I don't know what attracts me to that, but obviously we share that interest, and it's a great one. But let me give you a one of your questions. I think, Jason, was what makes it difficult research, and the same way serendipity works in some cases, it works against you in other cases. When I got the call from Doug, who was the president of the Motor Speedway, he said, "Why didn't you come and talk to us?" And I said, "Well, I did." I said, "I called." They had a historian, and I've forgotten his name. I called the guy about 3 or 4 times, and he never returned my call. And I said, "I heard later that he had retired." And the guy said, "Yeah, that's right. And he probably, your name got lost in the the shuffle. If I had called him and gotten in touch with him, I probably would have learned, as I didn't, about these 2 cards that were in the vault. So that's one time that it didn't work for me. But I did my best. I due diligence to get in touch, and when I did find somebody from the museum, by the way, the car that Pete got killed in is in the museum. It was reconstructed and raced again.
Wow.
But sometimes timing doesn't work out for you on the research. It's an interesting kind of thing.
For folks who don't really know a lot about racing or Indy 500, turn one is one of the most dangerous turns on it, correct?
Yes.
What makes it so dangerous?
Well, I came up with 3 or 4 different theories, and they're almost in historical sequence. When they first paved the track, there was a culvert under turn one that apparently developed a bump. And you know how culverts, you all driven on enough country roads to know that a culvert doesn't give like the rock around it. And supposedly, back in those very early days, there was still this bump. And I've quoted a couple of the drivers who say you could hit that bump, you could go flying into, outer space after that bump. Wow. They redid it. Of course, that's something you just have to take care of after you learn about it. But then I think there are 3 or 4 other things. One is, you've just passed the start finish line. Everybody wants to be the first guy through turn one. And in those days, the racing path was a lot more narrow. That is, now, I've seen pictures, I've seen races where there were 3 wide coming through that turn, and they went down to 2 wide very quickly. But I think at that point, the racing line was very narrow. They didn't have good suspensions. And if you didn't get down into that groove, then you were going to be hitting the wall, or you risk hitting the wall. So there's the competition to get through the turn first. There's the narrow racing line. And then, originally, there was no pit wall separating the racetrack from the pits. So anybody who pitted could come out of the pit at any place along the front stretch. Now that's crazy. And that would distract any driver. If you're headed toward turn one, it's coming up in 150 or 200 yards, and you see out of the corner of your eye something moving from your left, you're going to, that's going to really screw you up. And then they put pit wall in. But the entrance or the exit from the pit was very close to turn one. And it would have to naturally be that way because they needed enough room for the pits. That meant that who was coming back on the track, and I think the pits were a lot more active in those early days. So you would have that distraction. Now what they've done is they've built another lane inside the racetrack that takes people around to the back stretch, allows them to build up speed, and gets them inserted into the flow on the back stretch where there's not as much distraction. But we ought to ask Drew that question. Does that make sense to you, Drew?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I thought too, watching the Indy 500 recently, I've always felt the racing line they take is odd because, when you watch NASCAR, they come to the turn inside and go far out to the wall down the stretch. Yeah. They stay there. But the Indy cars, they come out to the wall out of the exit, and then they come back down to the bottom of the track and then swing back up to the top. So I thought that was a little interesting also. Also, Bill, I was just thinking too.
It is.
I was thinking about, remember the old days when the U.S. Grand Prix was at Indianapolis? And do you remember the last race they had there? They would exit out of turn one instead of enter into turn one. And they had all those cars they had to DNF because of the tire issues they were having on turn one. So I just thought about that. That's just interesting, the history of that turn right there.
It really is. And I tell you, I've slowly gotten to know Doug, the president, and I'm going to ask him sooner or later what his reaction to my description was, and see what he thinks, because he would certainly understand it. And there's an issue. There's still an issue.
Mhm.
And I think it has something to do with, I think it still has something to do with that great competition to get through that turn first.
Mhm.
And that even if you're back in the pack and you're racing against another guy who's 10 yards in front of you, you want to beat him through turn one. And I guess I understand that. By the way, one of the things I tried to do, and I'm no good at this, but I did when I began all this, I bought a Porsche 911 and learned to drive it pretty well. And I picked that car because that's what they say most IndyCar drivers would drive,
Oh, that's cool.
rear engine. And
Yeah.
and at any rate, I could never, I don't think I ever worked up to the, you go around the mountain roads and you can go pretty fast, or you can go pretty slowly, I should say, around mountain roads and still get a big thrill out of whether you're going to make it or not. And I don't think I never had a wreck in it, but I don't know. There's something fascinating. The other thing we haven't talked about, and both of you guys qualify on this. If you were a Southern boy growing up in the 50s or 60s or 70s, and I believe it continues on, if you didn't know how to talk about cars, you were lost. That was the topic of every lunchroom conversation.
Mhm.
That's I'm not close to any kids that age. I don't know whether it's still true, but you all probably have children that age. But is there still a great interest in cars?
Oh, sure. So my son is in his early 20s, and he and friends that he had from high school, whenever they still get back together in town, they get over to his friend's house and they go through their car and stuff like that. It's still a big thing for him. And even as a
Good.
kid growing up in Fentress County, I can remember going out to my Granny Dean's house and NASCAR being on in the living room, and race cars. I mean, it's just a tradition.
Yeah, my son is 5.
You know what'll happen to you. Okay. Well, you'll
just-
need to get him some little car.
Well,
I
I watch the race before church every Sunday.
Good.
That's like the tradition. This past Sunday, my oldest daughter woke up. She came out and looked at the TV and she goes, "I knew it," and slammed the door. But my son will sit and watch with me. But it's just funny talking about all this because my grandpa was in the tire business, and he would like sponsor dirt track racing, and my dad grew up a big NASCAR fan. So I'm kind of the black sheep because I like the sport car and Formula One and Indy, and I can't really get into the NASCAR. He was watching them on what they call a road course. I told him it looked like a pig trying to do ballerina or ballet. I'm sorry. But no, my son, he's getting into it also. But it's like you said, it's just always been there.
Well, do yourself a favor, save up a little money, and take a plane trip up to Montreal and watch that race, and stand by the wall. You can get right by the front. You can get right by it in many places. And man, once you see something coming by you at 200 miles an hour on the ground, that's an incredible thing. And Jason, the one thing I would say about NASCAR, and I could never get into NASCAR either. I went to one NASCAR race at Atlanta, and I don't like oval tracks. I don't know why I could get into Indy. I like open wheel racing. That's one thing. But I have trouble. I got to be honest with you. I have trouble watching Indy now, and it gets boring. And I wish that there were more curves in it some way. But Indy's Indy. By the way, I own a brick. I got a brick.
That's cool.
And so if you guys ever get up this way, you can stop and see the brick.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
And it's one of those things. I find my favorite poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, talks about, he has a poem that I love called Glory to God for Dappled Things. And I had, my last dog was a dappled dog, and he says, God causes this dappled and irregular patterns. And one of the lines talks about every trade and every hobby, including fishing, with the tackle and the hooks and all the different things. And I think that any subject like this that you get into deep enough has that kind of, what shall I say, has that kind of complexity that you can get into and begin thinking about. It captures your attention. And the more complex it is, the more intriguing it is. And to me, Formula One is infinitely complex. From deciding who's going to be on what team to the setting of the front wings to the, it's just incredibly complex. Why don't you listen if you want to do this again? When my book comes out about the Holocaust, I got a lot of stories about that, and they'll singe your hair. By the way, there's some real unbelievable cruelty and gruesome stuff in that book, and I'm just hoping I can get it out before my main character dies. He's hale and hearty. He still writes a column. He's a journalist. He still writes a column for the oldest paper in Virginia, which is the Virginia Gazette, founded before the Revolution. And he is an unbelievable human being. So,
yeah, that'd be.
I'll let you know when it comes out. And if I can ever do anything anymore for you, let me know. I applaud what you're doing.
Oh, thank you, Bill.
And if I had it to do over, I'd probably try to do something like what you all are doing.
Thank you. If you don't care if I ask one more question, I wanted to know, we're from Tennessee. Jason had talked about.
No, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Jason had talked about, this being a part of Tennessee history. We talk about Tennessee history to our students all the time. What do you want, I guess, Pete's legacy to be? What would to you be the message to learn from Pete's life and things like that?
Boy, because I studied literature for so many years, Drew, I'll probably go darker than you would want to repeat. But I think there is a side of life that's dark, and that people who have an obsessive personality can get caught up in it. Mm-hmm. And I think Pete got caught up in the family narrative of daring work and, of doing brave things. And just like his brother had been enlisted in World War I and got gassed, he had to do something to prove himself. And I think that's a very negative and obsessive thing. So I hate to say that would be his legacy in a way, but the other thing that confirms that to me is that his father would come up with that design for that tombstone that glorifies his sacrifice, if you will. And to me, the tombstone is a testament to a father's obsessive nature that teaches kids to dare. And, we look at, there's a parallel to the Kennedys. And I think it's a very sad sort of thing. I think if Shakespeare had it, he would write a tragedy about it. And I think the guy could not afford to admit that his career was over. and he didn't. The other thing people said to me, and this won't surprise you, said, I know a lot of academic people, obviously, because I lived with them for 40 years. But every now and then somebody would say, hey, I know what it is. This guy's gay. He's suppressing his gay nature. And I said, I don't think so. I haven't seen anything like that. But in a way, I can understand what they're reacting to. Here's a guy who went through life, never married. I have that few letters that I found, that refer to the night before the morning after and that sort of thing. And obviously women were intrigued with him. But I think it's about an obsessive family, a family obsessed with living up to the past. And I think that's a Southern trait that's sadly as thick as anything you can find in the Southern character.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time today.
You guys are real racing fans, so I'm glad to run into you. If you ever want to talk again, and by the way, if I get that article, I'll send you the article that I wrote.
Oh yeah, I would love
about what I found out from Indianapolis. And then you, if you will do me one favor, just write me back, say, what do you think of this? And I think I know how this may have happened. So I'll send it to you.
Okay, that sounds
great to talk to you guys.
Yes, thank you.
Appreciate it. Have a great day.
Okay.
Hey, if you're a fan of good conversations and fresh takes on literature and the kind of school stories that stick with you long after the bell rings, well, I've got a podcast for you. It's called With Honors, and it's where my high school students have taken the microphone, not just to analyze books or talk about our lessons, but to reflect on what we've learned this year, have conversations about what surprised them, how our literature and classroom experiences connect to their real lives. And we talk about everything from symbolism and Poe to the pros and cons of class pets, and all through the voices of smart, curious students who have learned to speak their minds. New episodes drop regularly every week, and every one is a snapshot of what it looks like when students take ownership of their own learning and have a little fun while they're at it. You can find With Honors on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and our YouTube channel, so check them out.